welcome, everyone. My name is Federico Ortino. I'm a member of staff at King's College London, and very happy to host this debate tonight. Just before I pass on the microphone to the chair, let me just say that the event is organized jointly by King's College London, particularly the School of Law, and King's Forum on International Dispute Resolution, which is one of the clusters of research and teaching we have here in the school, and the UK Trade Forum, which is recently established, and George will say a few words more about it. We, as a university, we encourage and promote these kinds of debates on topics such as this one. They may be controversial, but at the same time, we do enjoy discussing about them.
Good evening. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. I'm Director of the Institute for Government. I'm delighted to have here Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times, and Shankar Singham from the Legatum Institute, who's Head of Economic Policy and Prosperity Studies there, and also Head of their Special Trade Commission. And George is very kindly going to toss a coin, which was going to be a euro, and then we found the euro didn't have a head on it. And so we have retreated to a pound coin, a new pound coin, I think. George, George, first you toss it, and then Shankar, you pick.
Heads.
Heads it is.
Right. This isn't a formal debate in the sense that we are going to ask you to vote, but it is fairly formal in its structure, in that each of our speakers is going to speak for 10 minutes first, and then a short 5-minute riposte. Then there's going to be questions from you, and then a final parting shot, if you like. And with that, Shankar, off you go.
Okay. Bright light up there. Good evening. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I'd like to share with you this evening a positive vision of the future of UK trade policy in a way that secures the benefits of Brexit while minimising the disruptions that are leaving the European Union inevitably entails. And I think the referendum question has challenged us to do two things. We're doing two things here. One, we're leaving the European Union. And two, in trade policy terms, we are embracing the rest of the world. And we have to do both of these things well. I know that many people here think that leaving, the decision to leave, was a terrible mistake. Perhaps you feel this is an impossible process that can only impoverish the country. I hope that after this evening you will feel that there are positive benefits of Brexit and that it is worth developing a trade policy that can seize those benefits while mitigating the real disruptions that leaving the European Union will cause. It's not an easy journey. I fully acknowledge that it's not an easy journey, but the fact that it is difficult does not mean that it's impossible. So first of all, some words about the context that we're in. Before we frame the trade policy, we need to understand the context. And the primary context is that the global trading system, in my view, is in crisis. We've not had a serious global trade round for 23 years, which is about a third of the lifetime of the post-war GATT and WTO system. And if you'd been here in 1997 and you looked forward 20 years, you would be very positive about trade policy. You would say, we've just negotiated the Uruguay round, we've just negotiated the basic telecoms agreement, we've got financial services coming up, we've got energy services coming up, and we've got a built-in agenda on services where we're going to see countries offering all kinds of liberalisation in services, a huge part of global trade in the future. In the next 20 years, virtually nothing happened in the WTO and in the global trading system in terms of services liberalisation. That has meant that when you don't do that, when you don't make progress in that area, that is the reason why measures of industrial output, measures of wealth creation as opposed to GDP, which includes both consumer spending and government spending, have been somewhat stalled since before the financial crisis. That is why global trade, according to the Global Trade Alert, plateaued in 2015 and is only now, just recently, beginning to show signs of life once more. So that's the context. In that context, what do we need to do in the UK in terms of our trade policy objectives? First of all, we need to improve, these objectives are to improve our own domestic economy. The ability to do that is conditional on being able to change our own domestic regulatory system and our own trading environment. Secondly, we have to improve trading relationships with the rest of the world, which includes the EU, but also, critically, it's a big world out there. And then thirdly, playing our part as a major trading nation to improve global economic governance structures by contributing to necessary structural reform and the elimination of trade barriers and market distortions. The challenge is, of course, what trade policy could we have that would achieve those objectives? And I think from a business perspective, what you want to do is you want to ensure that you are understanding or advocating what you want the world to look like, not just the UK-EU supply chain, because clearly managers of the UK-EU supply chain will not want anything to change. So I believe you build this trade policy on 4 fundamental pillars. First, what we can do unilaterally. We need to be able to improve our domestic and regulatory environment. I don't believe that in terms of unilateral reforms in the UK, that the European Union regulatory system is a force for liberalisation and a force for reducing distortions. We've only got to look at the possibility of REACH-style regulation around the world, the General Data Protection Regulation, Financial Services Regulation, MiFID II, the list is a long list. And because of the Brussels effect, which many people have written about, there's a danger that firms will choose the most stringent regulatory environment, which destroys wealth out of the economy and contracts global opportunities. In agriculture, ferocious interpretation of the precautionary principle by the EU has thwarted new technologies and prevented non-EU firms from reaching EU markets, including the UK. This is wealth destructive, and it increases price for consumers. Regulatory autonomy, though, does not mean massive deregulation. What it means is better regulation, regulation that benefits consumers, benefits firms, and is not unduly burdensome and anti-competitive. It also means being free to reduce our own tariffs where we can, so that we can lower prices and give greater choice for consumers, particularly the poorest among us. Bilaterally, obviously there's the EU relationship, but there's also relationships with other countries, notably, for example, the US. Now, I don't think this is a binary choice. I think we can have a good, comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union, which we have advocated since July of 2016, including interim measures. Why do I think both sides will come to an agreement on this, which will include regulatory issues and regulatory recognition? Because A, there's too much aligned interest for this not to happen, but more importantly, with respect to regulation and the move towards pro-competitive regulation, the EU and all the member states have agreed in the OECD, in the competition assessment toolkit of the OECD, that regulation should be the least anti-competitive consistent with regulatory goal. They've agreed in the WTO, regulation should be the least trade restrictive consistent with the regulatory goal in the TBT and SPS agreements. So there is a framework on which we can build. The EU has agreed with the US in the insurance covered agreement regulatory recognition, even where other countries have different regulatory systems. Our ability to do bilateral deals with other countries will also help us with the European Union. It will make them a better negotiator. In my experience dealing with the European Union, if they think that they are the only game in town, you will not have a good result. If they know that there are other parties that we are negotiating with, we will get a better result. But critically, we cannot lock into the European regulatory system in order to achieve that result. We can't be in the customs union, we can't be in the single market. Now, we've got to be able to differentiate ourselves from the EU. If we present exactly like the EU, except smaller, then we are just a smaller version of the EU, and we are not interesting to other countries. The third limb is plurilateral, what we can do plurilaterally, and we've talked about accession to big platform agreements like the TPP, for which we would need control of our tariff schedules and regulatory autonomy. Finally, multilaterally, what we can do in the WTO. Trade policy is not formulated by simply aggregating the sum total of business inputs into the process. It is also based on geostrategic concerns. It is based on geopolitical concerns. And in the global battle between state-led capitalism and market-based capitalism, if you will, I believe the UK could be a key player. And so the fourth pillar of this agenda is how we operate decisively in the WTO. This is not to say that I believe the UK can be like some swashbuckling buccaneer from the 16th century telling other countries what to do. But the mere fact that the second biggest exporter of services, one of the biggest foreign investors in the world, one of the biggest sites of foreign investment in the world, is a trade policy player, will make a difference. And my conversations with chief trade negotiators from other countries, from WTO ambassadors from other countries, suggests that actually not only do they hope that the UK will play a part in this, but they would be surprised and disappointed if we didn't. And of course, UK firms will massively benefit from the liberalisation and the reduction of market distortions and behind-the-border barriers that will follow. So in conclusion, all of this means that we cannot be in the customs union. We must have control of our tariff schedules so that we can negotiate with other countries. We must have regulatory autonomy so that we can negotiate with other countries. We can't be in a customs union. We can't take, to have the services liberalisation that we need as a country of the second biggest exporter of services, we are going to need to have maximum flexibility to negotiate around the world. And that is why we can't be in a customs union of any kind. And I believe that our country is capable of harnessing the private sector talents, the public sector talents that we see and that we have. And I'm confident that we will succeed. And I believe that there is a bright future for the UK if it is able to implement this kind of trade policy. Thank you.
Anke, thank you, and you actually have 1 minute to spare, which doesn't go to Martin. Nor can you bank it in any way, so thank you very much indeed. Martin.
So, there are so many different debates we could have, and it'll be interesting to see where we end up in terms of agreement or disagreement. So first of all, the starting point. The UK has decided to leave the EU, and for the purposes of this debate, I'm going to accept that. Because that's another debate. Okay? It's completely another debate. But of course, leaving the EU doesn't tell us very much. As we all know, Norway is not in the EU, and the US is also not in the EU, but they are pretty different countries with very, very different policies. So we have an immense range of choices to make. How should we make those choices? Well, my view is that we should have to have some starting points. And the first starting point, which Schenker almost avoided but not entirely achieved, is please abandon all these windy rhetoric about global Britain and new opportunities, as if Germany isn't global, for God's sake, and if almost all the important ones were not available anyway. Nothing stopped us from being a successful exporter of manufactures, and take a sober recognition of the UK's position. Recognise, crucially, and this is very important in this context, that there are costs of over-swift adjustment that our fellow citizens might not find it easy to bear. And indeed, in some respects, they're already obviously with us in what has happened to our economy since the referendum. Third, and this was a point on which we had serious disagreement, recognise that the UK is not only a second-ranked power, but one in decline. Its share in world GDP was just 3.2% in 2017. It had fallen from 5.3% 10 years earlier. The United States, the rest of the EU, and China, the three genuine superpowers, account for 58% of world GDP. By these standards, we are, quite simply, a tiny minnow. The UK's share in world imports is just 4.8%, even excluding intra-rest of EU trade, and it has also fallen dramatically since 2000. Furthermore, we have to recognise that the EU is overwhelmingly our most important trading partner. This is to a small extent, but to a significant extent, because of our favourable access, but mainly because of distance. Fundamental empirical trade economics has shown beyond the slightest doubt the overwhelming importance of the size of the market and the proximity of the market. This is why, for example, the United States does vastly more trade with Mexico and Canada than it does with China, and we are as important a trading partner to the EU as is the United States, and far more important than China. 48% of our goods go to the EU, 36% of our exports of services go to the EU. There is no other market, or even sets of plausible markets, that are as important to us as the EU. Furthermore, we have to recognize, in addition, that a huge number of foreign businesses made their investments in the UK on the assumption that the UK would retain highly favourable access to the EU. And finally, we have to recognize, not even discussed so far by Shankar, that outside the EU, we will have to start off by working very hard to replace all the deals the EU has negotiated and is now negotiating. So given those starting points, what are the sensible options for this country? The realistic options, understanding our true position without all this windy and almost unbearable rhetoric. The transition, on that I think we've now largely converged on accepting a standstill. There can be discussion of how long it should be. It might not be as long as I would like, but we agree on that by and large, and we won't go into that any further. So what about the long run, beyond that? Some people, not legatum, hurry to say, recommend purely unilateral free trade. That rules out any form of bargaining with anybody else. All these MFN negotiations, free trade agreements disappear. We just have unilateral free trade. I think it's very implausible for the following reasons. The benefits, such as they are going to be very small. We will lose something really important, which is the possibility, and I agree with that, of negotiating improved access. And we do know that improved access matters. The small country assumption in all markets necessary for unilateral free trade to be optimal does not hold probably for any economy, and certainly doesn't hold for ours. So if we've moved purely unilateral deregulation and unilateral liberalization, we got to global engagement. Well, one possibility, which Shankar mentioned, was a true multilateral trade negotiations. As he's pointed out, that hasn't happened effectively since the late 1990s. The reason for that is that the global superpowers, who are always and always have been the countries that start such negotiations, are not interested. It's amazing that in his papers and today, the fact that Donald Trump is the President of the United States wasn't even mentioned. There is no appetite for a multilateral trade negotiations. It is not going to happen. Two, we can go through free trade agreements. The problem with the free trade agreements is that they fall into two categories. The important negotiations, which will be with the US, China, and increasingly India, are going to be unbelievably tough. Again, no discussion in their papers of what these countries are going to demand from us. We don't have time now to go into detail, but we can discuss it later. And of course, the easy ones, yes, I'm sure we can do a free trade agreement with New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. They amount to 3% of our trade. It's not worth discussing. And above all, we mustn't exaggerate the economic or other benefits of any of these global negotiations. They're going to be really rather small relative to what we might lose. And then finally, crucially, to make all this palatable, Shankar has suggested that we can have our cake and eat it, very familiar. We can get any deal we like with the EU, with managed divergence and mutual recognition, because it's in the interest of the EU to do so. Now, the account given of the EU in the legatum documents is quite extraordinary, because what it says is, here is this completely sclerotic, unbelievably bureaucratic, impossibly inflexible entity. which will nonetheless agree completely with us on our desire to have mutual recognition of regulatory standards to allow free service trade, which, by the way, hasn't worked, despite the examples he gives it, in any other negotiations. The only negotiations that have seriously liberalised trade in services at all have been within the EU. Now, I followed these things pretty closely for 25 years. The EU has ended up where it is, because that's where the EU wants to be. And if you think it trusts us, light touch Britain, to regulate our finances and other sectors soundly to go for mutual recognition, I've got a bridge to sell you. So what are the sensible options for us? First...
You've got about 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm getting to the very end. Recognise we've got ourselves in a hole. Stop this fantasizing. Second, we've got to make the EU our priority. If I could run the country, I would say European Economic Area plus Customs Union. But I recognise political reality. That would make us a vassal state forever, and it would almost certainly require acceptance of free movement. So unless we are prepared to reverse Brexit, which I agree is not a subject today, that option will not fly. Malcolm Rifkin said this in the paper today, and I agree with him. Second possibility, customs union. Yes, why not? It preserves access on goods. It solves Ireland in the simplest possible way. Yes, it will mean losing negotiating leverage in global and free trade negotiations, but that's just not going to be very important. Britannia is not going to rule the trade policy waves. If that cannot be negotiated, and I recognise that's technically and legally very difficult, then it is the Canadian deal. Yes, that's where we end up. But for that, we need a longer transition, ideally in the standstill period, and we have to recognise that there will be significant costs with that, and it won't be Canada plus, or not more than plus a very, very little. So where will we end up? Well, in a strange way, it's where Legatum suggests, minus all the exaggerated hopes for extraordinary deals out there. It's not going to be a good destination. It'll be a bad one, as all serious trade analyses have shown. The rhetoric we have surrounding these disappointing choices is, in my view, false. The end is going to be impoverishment and division. We haven't had 10 years of zero productivity growth because we're in the EU, for God's sake. We've made a foolish choice, and we will have to live with the outcome.
Thank you very much. All right, many questions we could all ask. We're going to press straight on. Shankar, you have 5 minutes to respond to that, among other points that geography matters, size matters. We're a minnow, the superpowers aren't interested, and our potential trade partners are going to jump all over us.
Great, okay. I'll just go through a couple of things that Martin has said. First of all, other options. Why do we think that we have to be in control of tariff schedules and in control of our regulatory environment? First of all, if you want to do trade deals with other countries, if you want to accede to these platform agreements, if you want to do anything in the WTO, in fact, which means if you want to have an independent trade policy at all, you've got to have control over those things. A partial customs union, which has been discussed, doesn't really work. It doesn't work because this problem it's trying to solve is to ensure that there are no checks. And so it's free circulation it's trying to preserve, which makes some sense. And it does mitigate some losses. But the problem is, in order to do that, it's the rules of the single market you have to accept in your partial customs union. It is the combination of those things that takes your trade policy off the table. EEA, EFTA type arrangements, all of these arrangements, as long as you are ceding control of your regulatory system, think about the negotiation with the US or with anybody else. You have to actually go, you have to sit at the table with them, and you have to say, we're ready to offer these things. If they say to you, we need this to be changed in order for us to do a trade deal, and your response is, well, you're going to have to talk to Brussels about that. We are not going to get very far, which is why we're going to present, just like the European Union, and that will be an unsuccessful result for us. Is the UK in decline, second-rate power, etc.? All I can say is that when I talk to people in the rest of the world, they do not share that view. They believe that they know, it's a fact, that the UK is the second biggest exporter of services. We are still a significant investor in the world. We are still a significant site for foreign investment. And in trade policy terms, that is actually what matters. And I think quite often, our view of ourselves and the way that the rest of the world views us are completely different. This is a point that Lockwood Smith has made. Our trade with the European Union, and how important is our trade with the European Union? Our trade with the European Union is very important, and no one has suggested otherwise. However, there are some facts here. One is that our trade with the European Union, our export of goods trade with the European Union in 1999 was about 64% of our total trade. It's down to about 44% now. And if you include Brussels, the Rotterdam effect, perhaps even slightly lower than that. So in a customs union and in a single market, your trade should be increasing because a customs union with its tariff wall forces supply chains to be inside the customs union. So there's something seriously wrong if that number is going down. And what's happening to the rest of the world while this is happening to us? Well, Australian trade, between 73 and 2012, Australian trade with the EU increased by 190%. Our trade increased in that same period by 70%. US trade with the EU increased by 120%. I mean, we are the lowest of the increases of major powers with the European Union during that period. Martin talked a lot about the gravity model, which you hear a lot about. First of all, with respect to the gravity model and trade and geography, the model is very specific about, and the proper gravity equation includes relativistic concepts. So, for example, it's not just about geographic distance, it's about cultural distance, it's about language distance, it's about regulatory barriers. Two countries next to each other with massive regulatory barriers are not going to trade very much with each other. So there are a lot of other factors, and in fact, we managed very big supply chains over 200 years ago. Not we, the UK, the world managed very big supply chains. So in 1820, the global copper price was set in Swansea. Why? Because we were mining copper in Chile, sending it back to the Welsh valleys where energy was applied to it and trading it around the world. There are very, very big supply chains. Now, New Zealand, which produces 3% of the world's milk and controls 30% of the world's dairy markets, how does it do this? It has massive supply chains that go from New Zealand to the UK, to the Netherlands, back to New Zealand, and they end up exporting infant formula to China. So we are quite capable of very significant, very long supply chains. And I haven't even mentioned services. And people will say, well, services, there's still movement of people issues with services, and you have to be close in proximity for people to move. Well, actually, no. The cultural distances are more important. Language distances are more important for movement of people in services. That's why more British people live in Australia than live in the European single market.
Thank you. You've got one
minute.
And a half minute.
Okay.
One other bit.
So, well, we agree on a few things. We agree on the importance of getting to the end state and that the implementation period is whatever it will be. We agree, I think, on the fact that we're going to have, ultimately, at the end of this, a trade agreement. Martin thinks that Canada plus, or Canada plus whatever, is not viable. I believe that the European Union, when they negotiate, their opening bid is always way above their bottom line. That is historical, just that's the way they negotiate. And if we stopped negotiating with ourselves and actually started negotiating with the European Union and figured out for ourselves that actually in any negotiation there are certain things that are very difficult to do, that take time, that need attention. And there are certain things that are deal-breaker issues in which you spend much more of your time. So the third country agreements that Martin talked about through the EU, the way to do that, first of all, is bilaterally go to those countries. Their customs authorities will determine if products in the UK that basically used the whole European Union supply chain are sufficiently accumulated to be regarded as UK products into those markets. Obviously, we need to maintain the same rules of origin as the European Union to do that, and we would like the European Union to say the same thing to those countries, which clearly they will, because access to these other markets is what is necessary for both sides. But we don't need to do that arm in arm with the European Union. And the same goes for our negotiation of tariff rate quotas in the WTO. We need to be able to do that bilaterally with those countries and offer further and deeper liberalisation to them, which is something the EU cannot offer to them. I think the European Union, and the crux of this, of course, the whole thing turns on regulatory recognition and pro-competitive regulation. And why I think they will do this is, the evidence I have for this is many things. I mentioned the US
Shanker,
EU.
you are now coming to the end.
Okay, I mentioned the US-EU covered agreement. They do mutually recognise AEO programs with 27 other countries that aren't identical to the European programme. So they can do this, and they have done this in the past, and I believe they will do that again. Most importantly, in the December WTO ministerial, the US, the EU, and Japan agreed that they would reduce market distortions in third countries and in whatever fora they could find. And if I was a UK negotiator sitting opposite the table of my European colleagues, I would say, you know, you agreed that in the WTO. We are a third country. We are a forum. Here are our ideas on reducing market distortion. Here are our ideas on regulatory recognition. They're built on the existing WTO and OECD frameworks, which you've already agreed with. Tell us why that's not a good idea.
Thank you. Martin, you have 5 minutes now, including on the point that regulation has undermined wealth creation in the EU.
So let's just thinking of how to handle the many different points that have been made. Just let me start off with, since it was a nice rhetorical touch before we deal with some of the more serious ones, that you have gone around meeting people, I presume in the trade negotiating community, who don't recognise my description of Britain's weight and position in the world. It probably says something about me, but I travel a lot and I meet an enormous number of policymakers and business people around the world. And outside the UK and one or two people on the wilder fringes of American Republican politics, I haven't met a single person who doesn't think our decision to leave wasn't crazy. So I don't know what foreigners you're meeting, but they ain't mine. And I have quite a wide range of people, including, of course, a very large proportion of people in the financial sector with whom I have engaged in lengthy discussions of the problems that this is going to create for us. At the end of point two, at the end of this, I'm still not quite clear what sort of negotiations at a global level you are envisaging, whether the UK can actually start in some strange way a multilateral trade negotiation which, unlike the Doha round, won't fail, or whether it is somehow going to be able to get a really good deal out of India that doesn't involve accepting, as I believe it will, a very large increase in the number of Indians free to work in this country, which might create some modest problems given the nature of the debate we just had on the Brexit referendum. In the case of the United States, we are clearly going to end up with very serious problems in negotiating on agriculture and, in my view, on services, particularly in the health sector. We may ignore that, but I suspect they will turn out to be very, very difficult indeed. And in the case of China, the idea, in my view, that they're going to open up their service markets to UK businesses in a large way is, I think, outrageously optimistic. And those are the three countries that are going to really matter. So that's the second big point. Third, on the history of EU trade. and the UK. Obviously, as a result of joining the customs union and the early creation of the single market, most of the liberalisation in the EU that affected us had been completed by fairly early in the 1990s. Other countries have benefited from substantial subsequent liberalisation, as you yourself mentioned, in the Uruguay round, and therefore I'm not in the least surprised, given the base that their trade with the EU has risen faster than the UK's. What is important is how much trade we do with the EU relative to our own economy and relative to that of other external countries. As I pointed out, astonishingly, we do as much trade with the rest of the EU as the US does. That's the gravity effect at work. And it's not because the people in Europe speak the same languages we do and the US doesn't. So that argument just doesn't work in any quantitative way as an effective argument. We come back, I think this is towards the end, yes, probably.
Yes, you got about 8 minutes.
To this question of how the EU is going to deal with us from a regulatory point of view. People, one of the things, just on a specific point before I get to the broader point, one of the things that trade ministers and other ministers are prone to do is signing documents that they don't mean. Like the Doha round, like the Paris Agreement on climate change, and like the one you just indicated on the way they're going to handle regulation. I try to focus on the difference between what people really mean and what governments like to pretend they mean. And I will tell you what the EU really means, in my view, and I've only followed it for 35 years. And that is, they are really determined not to have their regulatory structures undermined by what, in their view, are regimes interested in undercutting them through regulatory competition, which, by the way, is the model you put forward. I know you won't admit it, but that is the model you put forward. And therefore, they will, in my view, and we will see when we get to them, be incredibly unwilling to accept in any serious way the sort of mutual recognition you imply. We have to assume we will not gain the benefits. Now, to come to the very final point, I accept that because of where we got to, we will end up with Canada and not much more. The mutual recognition that we hope for will not happen. We will have significantly diminished trade with the EU as a result, as all the serious models say, and none of the other trade policy negotiations you suppose will make up for it. It is possible that by miracles of wonderful policy making in this country, despite this deterioration in our trading environment, our superb talent for wonderful, well-focused regulation, shown so perfectly in the most important area, land use planning, over which we have total control and has nothing to do with the EU. Because of our miracles in that regard, we will leave the EU. We won't get any of the closer deals. We will actually become fantastically successful, but it won't be because of the trade deals, because those are not what's going to make the difference. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. Lots and lots of points there. Let me ask you both, or each one question, before we go to wider questions. Shankar, let me pick up on one of Martin's final points there. We're facing, he says, the almost certainty of diminished trade, extremely diminished trade with the EU. And the EU is not going to give us the kind of deal you've described, which will allow us to have the kind of freedom we want in regulation. So what do you say to that proposition that we're almost certain to see diminished trade with the EU?
Well, as I said at the beginning, there is no doubt that leaving the European Union will entail disruptions. And therefore, that is why it is so important that we capture the benefits to the extent that I believe there are benefits. But certainly, envisaging a mechanism where you take all the benefits off the table and then you are only left with a damage limitation exercise, I think is not the appropriate starting point. I think you
but
want
disruptions
to try to
implies a temporary thing, and then we get over that transition. And do you accept? I mean, before I'm not dealing with this with the case for what we get from other trade deals from other countries, but is your picture that you're sketching this? Do you accept that there is likely to be diminished trade with the EU?
I think in terms of if you look at the world and where the fast growth areas of the world are, they certainly are not in the European Union. The fast growth areas of the world are outside of the European Union, and what we need to do is position ourselves so that we are able to access those fast growth areas. That's why we said
not what I'm asking. I'm asking, do you accept, as far as our trade with the EU goes, that it's going to be diminished by Brexit?
Our trade with the EU has been on a downward, as I said, has been on a downward path, and I think it will continue to go on a downward path in terms of percentage of UK trade with the EU as a percentage of our total trade.
Because of Brexit?
No, I think in terms of what access we will have to the European single market, that is something that we need to negotiate. And one of the concerns I have in all of these debates is that we do all the negotiating in rooms like this, when actually there's a negotiating partner out there who we should be negotiating with. And there are other negotiating partners who we should be negotiating with. And if we actually did that, one of the reasons you want to have agreements with lots of other countries and you want to have negotiations with other countries, is because if you do that, it is a hedge against the thing that we can't control. The thing that we can't control, and this is where I probably agree a little bit with what you're saying, is that the Europeans, we may put forward very reasonable regulatory recognition mechanisms, divergence management mechanisms, pan-European regulatory colleges, all of these things. They may make eminent sense. We may successfully lobby European politicians in member states and in subdivisions of member states and get European companies to actually advocate their own interests. We may do all of that, and the Europeans may still say, oh, we're not going to do it. But that's why you need to have a hedge. You need to be able to have ongoing negotiations.
Well, we'll pick that up in the questions. I mean, I agree with you that that is the inconvenient truth, that the EU may not accept what the British government has been kind of developing.
That's what's happened so far.
Yeah. Martin, let me ask you the flip side of that question, which is whether you see any opportunities from leaving. I'm not talking about net opportunities. You made your views completely clear that you think this is a mistake. But do you see any opportunities for Britain from shedding the constraints of being in the EU?
Let me put it precisely. As a result of leaving, we have choices we didn't have before. Okay? And we can, as is always true, we can exercise those choices wisely or foolishly. Looking at the British political scene at the moment, without being too party political, it's pretty clear to see that we now have an extraordinarily wide range of possible outcomes over the next 5 to 10 years, some of which will be absolutely demented, and some of which might be mildly sane. So there is no doubt that we have immense range of policy options, one. And two, clearly when we are outside, if we have decided for the political reasons that I've said that the EEA type structure is impossible and the customs union cannot be made to work, so we end up with a Canadian free trade agreement type of thing, then we would have to do our best, though I don't expect our best to be very much, but we would have to do our best to do other deals, because that's where we are. And it's obviously true that we would also have to do our best to create a policy environment in this country that made sense. Right at the moment, my confidence in our ability to do so is not as great as it might once have been. But it's clearly the challenge. Some of the proposals being put forward for the new deregulated free market Britain strike me as absurd, and Shankar has not, and I give him a lot of credit, gone there.
All right, I realise I should have asked you about benefits rather than opportunities. You've answered perfectly precisely that we have lots and lots of opportunities, many of them, as you said, maybe not completely sane. Let me go now to questions. They're going to be a lot. Right, let me start here, second row. Could you wait for the microphone, please? And if you'd like to give your name, that would be great.
Thank you. Sheila Page, Overseas Development Institute. A technical question to Shankar. One of the points of difference between you and Martin is over whether the EU has been, will be flexible in negotiations, or whether, as you say, it starts by asking for twice as much as it wants. Can you actually give examples of past negotiations where it hasn't got pretty much what it wants? And a more general question to both of you, on either of your expected outcomes, what happens to the commitments on Ireland, which were made 2 months ago?
Okay, great. Two good questions. Let's start there. I may begin to take them in twos. There's a lot of hands up, but we've got two good ones there. Shanker. Flexibility and Ireland.
So the EU being flexible. If you look at the various agreements, you can go back to 1997. You can go back to the US-EC Mutual Recognition Agreement that started with the transatlantic business dialogue and led to that conformity assessment process. I think you saw there EU flexibility now, or EC flexibility. Now that's 20 years ago. I think the US-EU covered agreement on insurance and reinsurance is a classic example of the EU starting with a position that was absolutely, and their general starting position on regulatory recognition is, of course, unless you're identical, we're not going to recognise you. I think it's important that we recognise that that is an outlier position with respect to the rest of the world, that actually under WTO rules, we should not mutually recognise each other where we can, as long as regulatory goals are the same and the pathway to achieving those goals is part of your regulation. Technical differences and technical divergences in regulation should not defeat mutual recognition. That is the WTO, that is the normal position. The EU's position is an outlier position. Now, that is, as I've given a few examples where I think that they can make changes. Now, we will not, there has never been a situation where you have two jurisdictions who have identical regulation on day one of the negotiation. And so this is an unusual situation. And you haven't had a situation where the two parties have been so tied together in terms of supply chains and in terms of overall alignment of goals. And I think, you know, we're not going to have radically different regulatory goals from the European Union. What we will have a problem with is the way they achieve some of their goals, particularly in the agricultural area and so on. But I think that we will achieve that sort of flexibility, but it depends what we do. And I actually agree with Martin on this point, which is if you negotiate by starting from the EU framework and working from there, and you basically say, well, whatever the EU says, we're just going to accept and we're going to just do whatever they tell us, in the hope that the goodwill will arise to negotiate better with them, then you are not going to get a good result. And yes, we have been doing a little bit too much of that. And that needs to change. We need to have a negotiating architecture that involves... There are no countries in the world that have two trade negotiators. Every country has one trade negotiator because that's the only way you can actually do deals across the piece and actually have a sensible trade policy. So we absolutely need to have one trade negotiator. The trade dimensions of the UK-EU agreement and the rest of our trade policy need to be under one roof with one negotiator. And if we don't do that, if we continue to bifurcate the EU process and the rest of the world process, yes, I agree with you, we will have problems. We won't be able to bring the pressure to bear on the EU that we need to. Now, I'll finally say that every trade negotiator feels under enormous pressure. They should do. They should feel under enormous pressure. I don't get a sense that Michel Barnier is under any pressure at all. Now, one of the things that needs to happen, a sensible negotiator, when I started doing work in trade policy and trade law, they would say, if you're negotiating with the US, you negotiate with the member states of the US. You negotiate with the special interests of the US. If you're negotiating with the EU, you negotiate with the member states. We haven't done that in a serious fashion. We need to do more of that. We need to identify the real costs to European companies and where those costs are located, because those costs are actually located in some very difficult places. Bavaria for cars, Catalonia for cars, northern Italy for textiles and so forth. We need to also make clear that the cost of not having a financial services agreement with the EU and a potential fragmentation of the single capital pool in the City of London will actually contribute to an increased capital cost on the continent that will damage European businesses. On Ireland, what was made very clear, some points about Ireland. First of all, Northern Ireland trade into the GB as a percentage share of their trade is 21%. Northern Ireland trade across the border into the Republic of Ireland is 5%. And the figures are about the same if you reverse, Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland and into GB. So actually what matters more for Republic of Ireland interests and for Northern Irish interests is ensuring that we have a good trade agreement with the EU. That is the thing that matters the most. There are many ways we can mitigate the issues related to hardening of the Irish borders in terms of trusted trader programs, AEO programs. There are 53 non-SME businesses in Northern Ireland that trade into the Republic of Ireland, 53. Most trade across the border is high-frequency, low-volume trade. There is, under the Union Customs Code, a €6,000 exemption where you don't have to prove you don't have to prove origin. We can do special economic zones in Northern Ireland. If the EU actually wants to help the Republic of Ireland, they would allow them to do a contiguous special economic zone into the border region of the Republic of Ireland. The Poles had a devil of a time trying to get their free trade zones agreed in the EU. But this is something the EU could do as an indication that they are treating the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland situation as a unique and special case. And in terms of technology, the European Parliament has already reported on this and talked about what technology can arise as a result, in order to make sure that we're not hardening the Irish border as much as we can. But regulatory alignment means what it generally means in WTO terms, which is alignment of your regulatory goals. And those regulatory goals must be aligned across the key sectors of the Good Friday Agreement, under the agreement. Strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement envisages several working groups, including the special EU cooperation working group, which is ideal for monitoring the trade flows between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. There are many things that we can do that are consistent with the Good Friday Agreement and recognise the fact that there is already a border in Ireland. There is a border for tax, there is a border for VAT, there is a border for other arrangements between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And there are solutions that the people of goodwill can come to. The question for the European Union is whether they're willing to exercise that goodwill, or whether they're in fact using the situation to achieve a particular goal.
Thank you. Martin, you have something?
On Ireland, I sort of agree. The numbers I know and share, and it seems to me that I would like to stay in the customs union, but regard that as probably difficult and unlikely. But it seems to me that if the EU is going to essentially say a country that is not in the EU can't be properly in the customs union, then it has decided that the obvious solution, or that part, the obvious solution for Ireland doesn't work. If it has decided that, and it has decided that therefore we're going to a free trade area at best, then it has to come up with a solution. I think that's what Shankar is saying. And so for once, I'm absolutely on the side of the British government. That's point one. Second, on the points, very, very briefly, on the points made about British negotiation, I would tend to agree that it would be a very good thing for the British government to stop negotiating with itself. No doubt about that. I have no solution to that problem. However, I'm much less persuaded than Shankar is that if we stop negotiating with ourselves, we will suddenly find in all sorts of ways the EU will be very amenable. I think one of the problems with this sort of discussion we have here is, and I would like to stress this, that from the other side, this is an existential negotiation. This isn't just another...
For the Europeans.
Trade. Yes. Yeah. So they view lots of this in quite a different way from the way we are inclined to view it. Why are they being so unreasonable? Finally, on mutual recognition, I certainly don't want to go through all the history of that, and there are many people here who are more expert. My view of what has actually happened, and I've looked at this over a whole range of issues, probably the one I've focused on most in the last 10 years is financial sector regulation, not WTO covered, that people are perfectly happy to do mutual recognition where it really isn't important. politically or any other way. But when it's really important, you try going for mutual recognition on capital requirements in the banking system. So I'm afraid in the areas that really matter to the EU, and that's how we started the single market programme. It was supposed to be mutual recognition. That's what Lord Cockfield suggested. And it's not where we ended up because it turned out to be too difficult. I mean, this is just a practical, sensible, practical view. I think we should not expect too much of mutual recognition. I put it more colourfully earlier, but I really think that we're incredibly naive if we think we'll get much out of it.
I'm sure you're right. It's it's existential for Europeans. It arguably feels existential for the two main political parties here, though, as well, which is why they can't simply
somewhat
stop
existential,
negotiating.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Let's take some more questions here on the aisle, third row, and I'm going to take another one. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Hi. Chris Gentle, independent consultant. I wanted to focus on the future and two things, really. One, about our capability in terms of trade. So the figures, the 5 years before the referendum, showed a trade balance increase over those 5 years of about 26 billion, as I understand it. 40 billion of that was services, but actually a decline of about 12 to 14 billion in manufactured. So what does the panel think about our capability as a business capability to actually drive exports?
You mean a deterioration in the size of the trade deficit?
No. In terms of, yes, in terms of manufacturing, the total amount manufactured over those 5 years, and the UK exports declined in those 5 years.
Yeah, sure, that's true.
Yeah,
right.
and services increased. So we had a positive trade balance, but it was actually a negative one for manufacturing positive. My question is not about that. My question is about the capability of the UK to grow in the future. How are we going to fix that problem, number one? And number two, if you look at the 40 years that we've spent in the EU, the average person in the UK is twice as well off in terms of income as they were. If you take the US as a comparator, they're 1.52 times better off. In the next 40 years, where will we be? That's a question to both the people in the panel. Now, I know it's a long time in the future, but if you could help us on that, it would be good. Because disruptions about where we might get to is not a very quantitative way of looking at it.
Thank you very much. I want to get some more questions in here on the aisle as well.
Hi, Will de Vries, iFreeTrade. The FT published recently what it thought was the key tenets of the Lighthizer Doctrine, which posits, firstly, that trade had been wrong for America since 1994, that the WTO was a mistake, needs to be fixed, that China poses an existential threat to the US economy and the global economy, and that if the current administration is more fierce in negotiations with foreign powers, that the States can indeed make its way back. Now, I wonder what the speakers think, what impacts the speakers think that this will have on potential US-UK FTA talks.
Okay, thank you for that. Martin, do you want to start on those?
I don't think I'm going to comment on... Economists are ridiculous, but even I'm not going to forecast GDP per head growth over the next half century. And I'm perfectly happy to agree with anybody here that will be determined to a very high degree by what we decide and, of course, the fundamental nature of the world we live in, not these things. And perhaps that links with the third question. I'm not going to talk about the capability of trade. I'll leave that to Shankar. But I mean, obviously, one of the most important things that is going on, which I really do think you have to get into your discussions, is what is going on in the US. Mm-hmm. So this is either a blip or it's not. My guess is it isn't, but I don't know. But I know Mr. Lighthizer. I've followed his work fairly closely since the early 80s because I used to work entirely on trade policy then, and he was very actively engaged in the period we've tended to forget of high protectionism from the Reagan administration against Japan. And he views trade policy as an instrument of economic warfare, although he would certainly say it's against people conducting economic warfare. This is now the doctrine. I understand he's now the most influential trade policy figure. He's surpassed Wilbur Ross. And Mr. Trump is very sympathetic. We don't know what, as a result, is going to happen with the NAFTA agreement, which Lighthizer is largely running and is very, very difficult. And we certainly don't know the nature of the deals. But we must assume that American trade policy is going to be, in any terms we think of it, very mercantilist. I mean, really very mercantilist. And I think that I think it's perfectly true, they will look on the UK more favourably than most other countries. That's certainly true of Mr. Trump, but they're going to run a pretty hard bargain. We just have to reckon that. But more important, Mr. Lighthizer is now engaged in a deliberate, systematic, and remorseless campaign to destroy the WTO dispute resolution system, and that really will matter to us when we're outside on our own.
US.
Yeah, so let me start with the US and Robert Lighthizer and the whole Trump administration approach to trade. I actually think that we don't actually know where the Trump administration is going to land on trade policy issues. There is a dynamic within the Trump administration which is bring me tariffs, which is the sort of protectionist wing that you're seeing. But there is also another dynamic which is, and I think that is more accurately what the Lighthizer doctrine sort of actually is, which is we basically, over the last 25 years or so, did a reasonable job on lowering border barriers, tariffs and border barrier issues. We did a reasonable job on that. We did a reasonable job on protecting property rights. But actually, we allowed regulatory protection and market distortions in countries, especially China, where you have extensive reduction of costs of China firms in ways that are anti-competitive. For steel, it's free land, free water, free energy, etc. Lowered their costs, and they're now competing on a sort of non-level playing field. And so here's why the steel worker in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan, etc., have lost their jobs. And Trump is responding to that. Now, there are two responses to that. One is, as I say, massive protectionism. The other is to say, can you actually deal with some of these distortive practices? And I think you've actually seen from the US administration a few indications that actually this doctrine may be more about reducing distortions in other markets. Now, first of all, in credit cards, the US was able to get from China a memorandum of understanding and agreement. And admittedly, it's a memorandum of understanding, doesn't mean the Chinese will follow it. But it is something that no one else has got on the ability of foreign credit card providers not to have a non-level playing field with China Union Pay. So you do have that going on. You also have, and I think the WTO ministerial was actually quite an indication of a move from if the multilateral system fails, then nothing happens and there's no agreement, to more of a plurilateral framework where you actually have. So, for example, in the e-commerce working group, where the multilateral e-commerce working group was not successful in the recent Buenos Aires trade ministerial. Stephen Chobo, and this is to the point that the UK can play a role, Australia was able to bring 70 countries together on e-commerce to launch the plurilateral agreement. Stephen Chobo did fantastic work in that area. But the US played a part in this plurilateralization of a lot of the WTO initiatives. And I think that's where we might actually see from the US a bit more of a constructive approach with respect to the multilateral trading system. If their particular needs, which are to do with distortion, are being actually played out. And you obviously have in the WTO also the domestic regulation work, which again the US will have a very strong position on. So I actually think that it's a bit more nuanced and we don't really know where it's going. But remember Donald Trump, who famously pulled the US out of the TPP, has relatively recently said, well, I can envisage a world where the US was back in the TPP. So, and on NAFTA renegotiation... The
point you're making by that is what?
That it's a nuanced position, that it's not...
It's a changing position, that's not the same thing.
It's a nuanced position, and it's a position where the more Trump listens to his own private sector and his own Congress, the more he is moving towards a more rational and normal US trade policy. It's not to say I think it's the perfect trade policy. I think there are major problems with the US in trade negotiations, and Martin correctly mentioned the appellate body and the WTO and their approach to that. That's because they're losing cases. But on the other hand, I would also say that normally what would have happened, what happened in Nairobi in the trade ministerial, was an agreement not to agree. This is the ministerial declaration we got out of Nairobi. Well, there was no declaration that came out of the Buenos Aires ministerial, and Lighthizer left. He came for a day, he didn't get what he wanted, and he left. And actually, the fact that he left has made the rest of the world understand that they are also participants in the system, and they need to not rely entirely on US leadership all the time. And we don't have US leadership, which is one of the reasons why the second biggest exporter of services needs to get to the table.
Thanks for that. Let's take some more. Are there people at the back? Let me take, sorry, the lights are very bright. The person furthest back. Yes. Yep. But it helps the record and all kinds of things.
Mr. Wolf, you started off being incredibly negative about the position of the United Kingdom. And you remind me of a Japanese soldier in the jungle who can't accept that the war is over. and you said that you accept that we are where we are, and then you continue to bang on, quite clearly making the point that you're not very happy at all that people have voted to leave the EU.
Thank you. Do you have a
question?
Thank you.
The question, you said that 48% of our goods go out to the EU. Does that take into account the Rotterdam effect? 48% of our exports.
The answer is I looked at that.
I thought you'd know that.
Yes, I looked at that, and the answer to that is it would knock off a couple of percentage points.
Does anybody else know if that's correct?
And would you like, I have a question.
So you're not sure of your figures?
No, I'm absolutely sure of my figures.
Okay,
48% is the official trade figures. The Rotterdam effect is a guess, but the guess is that it would knock off about 2 percentage points.
You have a fantastically negative view of an amazing opportunity in front of us. Look at the wealth of Singapore.
That's another point.
Excuse me, sir. Thanks for your point. Would you like to say who you are?
Oh, sorry, yes. My name is Russell Hicks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's take another one right here on the aisle.
Thank you. Michael Gasserek, University of Sussex, UK Trade Policy Observatory. First of all, I have two questions. First question is for Shankar. You talked about possible disruptions from leaving the EU for the UK. You talked about that we should focus on talking to EU partner countries and think about the cost to them. So there's clearly an element of cost from Brexit. So I have a very specific question, because I know the Legatum Institutes have done various bits of quasi-empirical work. If the UK, when the UK leaves the EU, imagine that there was no change in regulations, no better regulation. Without that world, what do you estimate would be the impact on the UK economy? Or to put that question slightly differently, how big a productivity change do you need from better regulation in order to mitigate, offset against any possible negative effects? The second question is to both speakers, and it's a version of Sheila's question earlier, but I want to sort of make it slightly perhaps more focused, which is, do you believe that it is possible not to have border controls in Ireland if the UK leaves the customs union and the single market?
All right, thank you. Good questions. Though, could people restrict themselves to one from now on? I'm going to squeeze in two more in the same round. In the green shirt.
Hi, Jack Graham, Apolitical. We've talked a lot about the trade of goods and services, but going forward into the future, the movement of people is going to become an increasingly huge part of trade negotiations. After Brexit, both within the EU and in the so-called global Britain, especially with places like India, who've been very strong on their demands for freedom of movement of people, where do you see the future of free movement after Brexit?
Thanks. Very good question. Let me get in a third right in the middle. Yep.
I just wanted to ask the panel, because I got a bit stuck. Could you just expand on the point about why a trade deal with Canada would be difficult? Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to give your name? Oh, no. That's all right.
Francesca.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Francesca. All right. A mixture of interesting questions there. Shankar, do you want to start? Briefly, we have a harder stop than Brexit itself in about 3 minutes. So these are last thoughts. Impact, Ireland, migration, and Canada.
Okay, right. So in 1.5 minutes. So the question about the trade, I think this is a critical question, which is how do you mitigate the trade costs of divergence? There will be trade costs of divergence, not only divergent regulation, but the lack of free circulation, etc. What are you putting in the balance against that? And I believe that the ability to reduce, I believe the world, Minister Prabhu from India, even the Minister Prabhu from India, talked about the surpluses that were available in the world, that there is a lot of market distortion around the world. There are huge surpluses that are possible. And I believe that the weight of anti-competitive, what we've called anti-competitive market distortions and regulation, is significantly greater than the trade costs of divergence. And that if we are able...
Michael, I'm so sorry, we can't get into a debate. You can afterwards, but not now.
If we are able, and it is an if we are able to meaningfully reduce some of those anti-competitive distortions around the world, which I think are huge, then actually that will offset considerably the trade costs of divergence. On Ireland, I think this is about alignment of regulatory goals, and that is where we are going to have to go. I actually think that we conceded a lot on that point in December, and I'm not sure that was the smartest thing to do. But we are here where we are, and we're going to have to make the best of it. But that was a significant change. When I think about this process and how much we're taking off the table as we negotiate it, that was clearly an issue. I don't think there are any other things that we have done that have really taken opportunities off the table, but that agreement was an issue. Movement of people, we're talking here, I think the future of movement of people is really in the trade context, mode 4 services. This is, I set up an office I'm a service provider, I set up an office in another country. I want to move my people to that office for 10 years under a business visa or whatever that we want to do. We are going, and Martin's absolutely right about this on the India agreement. I think there is an agreement we can do with India. It involves reduction of agricultural barriers. It involves moving away from the precautionary principle. Residue issues for India are very significant because of basmati rice and the ban in the EU. We have to do all of that, and we are going to have to give them mode 4 services. But every country in the world is going to ask for mode 4 services. We're going to have to give this in trade negotiations. I don't think it's going to be a massively problematic issue for people who are sort of strong Brexiteers, if you will, because I think there's a big difference in people's minds between the concept of European citizenship and free movement of people under mode 4 services, temporary business visas. I think in people's minds there are differences there. And then the final thing, I presume you mean the difficulty of getting a deal like the CETA deal between the UK and the EU, not a deal with Canada. But I think that's going to be
like the deal that Canada has with the EU.
As with you, I think that's going to be the starting point, and we are going to have to negotiate well, particularly on this area of regulatory recognition. We're going to have to do everything in our power, which involves negotiations with other parties, involves work with member states, involves everything that we can do to put some pressure on Michel Barnier. And if we do, I believe we'll get that kind of deal.
Martin, some last points you want to chip in does not have to be
on the last one. I hope you're right. On regulations, you asked a very precise question. Obviously, I can't answer that. But I will make a general point, which is I have read an awful lot from people, slightly different views on all this, about how eliminating regulatory distortions, presumably in the UK, will lead to extraordinary improvements in productive efficiency. I just don't know where these numbers come from. I really don't. I think as I said, I have no doubt at all that the biggest regulatory distortion in this country is land use planning, and we're not going to do anything about it. The Irish problem is not going to be very easy to solve, but for reasons we've discussed, that will be the EU's problem as well. I don't think we had any choice but to put forward this form of words, otherwise we wouldn't have proceeded beyond the first round of the discussions, and the British government finally, after 8 or 9 months, realised it wouldn't get anywhere if it didn't concede. So we had no choice, as we will have later in this negotiation, I think. But it's going to be very difficult to solve the Irish problem with the sort of outcomes we're talking about. And finally, I think Mode 4 will be significantly more problematic than you suggest, but it always depends on numbers, on scale. I don't think we have time to explain what Mode 4 is, so
no, we don't.
We'll leave that aside.
Leave it aside.
A more profound question, which we haven't discussed rightly because it will be a big issue, is, and you do discuss that sensibly in your paper, is we are going to have to end up with a new immigration policy. And I have noticed that the British government hasn't really got very far in developing one, presumably because ministers are profoundly in disagreement on this, and rightly so, because it is a hugely difficult question, one of many that we'll be confronting in the years ahead.
We will. On that note, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for terrific questions. I'm really sorry I couldn't get them all in, and actually not close to get them all in, but they were very good ones. There will be much, much more to say on this. And I say, just on behalf of my home team at the Institute for Government, we publish an awful lot on this too, and we'll take issue with these things. Many thanks to the organisers, King's and the UK Trade Forum, and to Martin and Shankar.